Hey everyone, I'm going to provide you a brief overview of some of the content in Chapter 2. You have your PowerPoints that are uploaded. I'm going to reference them when you see me looking this way. I'm referencing the PowerPoints that I have up on my other screen. And then, of course, I've got some additional information that I want to provide to you just as a supplement to the material in your book. And again, referencing some of my research and my work with clients. So in Chapter 2, you talk the book talks a little bit about the professional licensure of addiction counselors. So what is it like to work as an addiction counselor and in the addiction counseling field? It talks about the ethics of addiction counseling, which at times can be a little different or seem a little different than the ethics that counselors that we abide by. So the ACA Code of Ethics, there's a separate set of ethics for addiction counselors who are licensed, certified, or registered addiction counselors. We'll get into that in a minute. And then it talks about general information about confidentiality and HIPAA. So HIPAA comes into play when in releasing information and notifying folks of your clients where their information is stored, how it's stored, how you're going to keep it safe, and then of course their informed consent as clients. The chapter does go into ethical decision making. It's my general thought that because I'm a counselor, I am an addictions counselor, but I'm also an LPC. So I follow the ACA Code of Ethics in dealing with any and all ethical decisions that I have to make. And you will have to make some tough calls, and you will have to process ethical dilemmas. And so you're going to have an ethics class, and in that ethics class you go over ethical decision-making models. There are several, and so we're not going to go too much into that for this class. We'll touch on it, but your book touches on it, and I'll sort of briefly say something about it. But the going through the ethical decision-making models, whichever one you choose, in addiction counseling will be the same as any other counseling. You may have to consider a few components, or maybe additional components, or consider aspects that might be a little different because you're working addiction counseling, but the process is the same. So let's just sort of jump into licensure, so the education and training of mental health counselors. So there's a couple of ways to be licensed or certified as an addiction counselor. One level is so the minimum criteria for being an addiction counselor is to have a high school diploma, very specific addiction counseling training and education that is provided by the state addiction board, and supervision working as an addiction counselor. And you need a high school diploma or equivalent, and you can be a certified addiction counselor or a registered addiction counselor. The level of certification or registration changes state by state. So then the next way to be an addiction counselor is to have a bachelor's degree specific addiction counseling training, specific addiction counseling work, so specific number of hours working in addiction counseling, and then supervision as an addiction counselor. So that's another one. That's another certification or registration in addiction counseling that you can get. Minimal education there is the bachelor's degree. So again, we have one level that just requires education, high school diploma or equivalent. The next is a bachelor's degree. And then there's another license another level to this license that requires a master's degree or higher. And these are your LCAS. Here in North Carolina, it's called an LCAS. And you have to have a master's degree or higher, specific addiction counseling training and education, specific addiction counseling supervision, specific number of addiction counseling work. And that's what I have. I think I mentioned that. So in Louisiana, it's LAC, Licensed Addiction Counseling. Here, it's the LCAS. So So that's an interesting perspective, right? Or an interesting thing that not all areas of mental health counseling have. There are 3 different ways to actually be certified, registered, or licensed to sit in front of somebody and counsel them. Now, there are some specific requirements, like the folks with just addiction counseling registration or certification, they are not supposed to work with any other issue other than addiction. However, as some of you guys have already mentioned in some of your posts, and as we will talk about extensively during the semester, it's hard to separate addictive use disorders from comorbid disorders. They sort of 9 times out of 10 go hand in hand. So how do you sit across from a client and say, I can only talk about your addiction, I can't talk about your depression, or I don't really know how to, or I'm not qualified to talk about it. And so that's just it's an interesting conundrum. It's an interesting sort of professional issue and concern that exists in addiction counseling. I think I mentioned in my introduction, the basis for my dissertation was looking at 2 constructs across those various licensures. Another component to addiction counseling licensure is recovery status. So it is common for an addiction counselor to also have had experience in addiction, so with an addictive use disorder, and they may be in recovery. And one of the criteria for being certified, registered, or licensed, the application usually asks, have you been sober for a certain amount of time? Have you been in recovery for a certain amount of time? That's not a question that we ask any other license, that we ask on other licensure levels. But in addiction counseling, it's a question, and a large percentage of folks working in addiction counseling do have personal experience with an addictive use disorder and are in recovery. So that's another factor that is a little different and unique in addiction counseling. So, I just want to throw that out there. You guys aren't sitting in front of me so we can have a discussion, but think about that. Think about those various levels and ways of being an addiction counselor. Again, just you don't have to have a master's degree. And then the fact that recovery could potentially be a component of your, could be a part of your history, could be a part of your story as a counselor or your counselor identity. And now I just encourage you to think about, I want you to think about things like ethics, and think about things like boundaries, and think about things like disclosure. So, I'm a big believer in, I don't disclose a lot with my clients. I don't tell them a lot about me. And so a factor in recovery is sharing my story with you, sharing my experience with you to help you through your recovery. Well, we don't do that in counseling. My story and my history and my experience is really not relative or necessary or important when I'm sitting in the room with someone, because it's their time, it's their story, and my focus is on them and with them. So think about that. And, as always, I welcome any comments and feedback. I'm spending a lot of time on this because I think it's a really important component. But anyway, so going through the ethics of addiction counseling work, as counselors, you're going to have a master's degree. And if you work in addiction counseling, you'll have a master's degree in either clinical mental health or professional school counseling. And you follow those code of ethics. And so I follow the ACA code of ethics. I follow those very closely. And that's the basis of my work. And I want to jump into, let's see. There are, in addition to the different licensure levels for addiction counselors, there are various organizations and boards that oversee the licensure process and even have separate ethical codes. If I jumped around here and confused you guys, I apologize, but right now I'm just looking at the second PowerPoint that's education and training, because it ties into ethical codes. So NBCC has some master's certifications. International Association of Addiction and Offenders Counselors offers a certification. And NADAC, your book lists NADAC as having a credential. So these are different organizations. There's one other one, International Certification and Reciprocity Consortium. That's sort of a bigger certifying agency, and they are the certification agency that affords individuals in North Carolina that offers them the test to be an LCAS. So it's the same in Louisiana. And I know this is, alphabet soup here, and there's a lot of acronyms, but what you need to know is that there are separate certification agencies for these separate licensures that exist in addiction counseling. And so imagine being a counselor and you want to work in addictions and you want to be licensed. Well, you're not going through your LPC board. You're going through a different board that oversees addiction counselors, and that board may use a certification company that administers the test. So it can be a little confusing. I don't want to say that to discourage anyone from being licensed, but imagine navigating those waters as a counselor. So I have these various boards that I report to, and it's my duty to tell my clients I have various boards that I report to. So with that, these boards and these organizations can have different ethical codes, and your assignment for this chapter talks about some of the sticky points or the sticky little ethical conundrums or dilemmas that exist when working in addiction that may not necessarily exist in other fields. So going back to what I mentioned earlier, here's just an example. If you're in recovery and you're an addiction counselor and you relapse, what do you do with your clients? Think about that for a second. So now we're talking about abandonment issues. Maybe you've gone to treatment, and that's a fantastic aspect, but you have relapsed and you are not seeing your clients. And so now what are they doing? Was there a proper referral put in place? Who's handling your caseload? And then, of course, like I mentioned, the disclosure issue. Do you talk to your clients about being in recovery, or do you go sort of the more conservative counselor route where disclosure is minimal and only if it benefits the client? So some things to consider as you read this chapter. Confidentiality in addiction counseling is exactly the same in every other counselor, in working with other mental health disorders and being a counselor in any other sort of realm. You have a duty to break confidentiality if your client expresses a desire to harm themselves, meaning kill themselves. And I think it's important that we say that out loud, that if your client says they want to kill themselves, if they say they want to kill someone else, or if there's reasonable suspicion that they have harmed or could potentially harm a child, somebody elderly, or someone disabled. And that's the same. So, it may not be uncommon for you to sit across from someone who struggles with an addictive use disorder and hear some of the things that may have happened. So it may be that in someone's active addiction, they did kill someone. Well, in that instance, we don't have anyone to warn. What are your thoughts? One of the consequences or one of the associated consequences with addiction, and is that folks don't necessarily always follow those morals, values, and beliefs that they hold to be true, and so they may engage in behaviors that they don't necessarily believe in, and harming other people may be one of those. Of course, not always, but be mindful of your limits to confidentiality. So if there is suspicion, or they did mention that they harmed someone elderly, disabled, or a child, you do have a duty to warn. So confidentiality is exactly the same. Going through The Federal Code of Regulations, excuse me, the Code of Federal Regulations that your book mentions. Definitely read up on that. Your responsibility to protect their records and their information is exactly the same